This contrast, that constant scanning, the noticing of those differences, enables readability. Text is easy to read when we're using stark complementary colors, right? Black on white, instantly readable, no problem. Even when we have a design where text is the brightest element, when we have white on black, that also reduces eye strain because it focuses attention. There's a myth that white text on black is harder to read than black text on white. It is simply not true, unless that text is so small that the differences between the white characters and the black background isn't obvious enough. When that text is too tiny, it's too hard for the eye to identify those boundaries and for the brain to perceive them. Now, if we have a lack of contrast between the text and the background, like you see here, that causes eye strain because our eyes don't know which color to focus on. If you've ever used a camera with an automatic focus feature, have you ever seen the instance where the lens is trying to focus and it's going in and out of focus, trying to find a spot? If you hold up your smartphone, right, your iPhone or your Samsung or whatever it is, you'll see the same behavior as it tries to autofocus. It'll be fuzzy for a second, and then it'll focus. This is what's happening with your eyes and your brain when you look at something that lacks contrast. You're bouncing back and forth between the two things all the time because you can't settle on one thing. There's no dominance. And just because colors are complementary doesn't mean that contrast is appropriate. If both colors are too bright, as they are here, eye strain again is the result. All right? I talked about saturation in the last section. When saturation is too great, same problem. It's very hard for us to settle on one thing because they are both screaming for our attention. Contrast is also used to draw attention. The areas of highest contrast draw our attention first, and contrast should always be applied according to importance, which means that primary content, primary actions, the things that you absolutely need people to focus on, and the things that they need to be able to focus on, should have the most contrast. So if I'm designing something and I have a big gray square like this, that's where your eye's drawn because it's the only thing on the screen. If I add a gray bar inside that dark gray square, well now, because it's a shade of the background color and because it's lighter and there's more contrast, it's drawing your attention, okay? It's framing your view. If I add a white area and then add some text there, now your eyes are drawn here because of the contrast that exists between that background, the white background, and the screen's background, the dark gray. Your eyes and your brain are working to detect those edges. And wherever the difference between those edges is the most pronounced, that's where your eye goes. What's important about that is that contrast directs focus, which means wherever you apply the most contrast is where the user's attention will be drawn. Which also means you have a responsibility as a designer, and that is to be absolutely sure that that element's the most important thing on the screen. Because if it isn't, you're directing the user's focus in the wrong place. Okay, take a look at this Dollar Shave Club homepage. Where does your eye go? It certainly goes to that image because it's taken up a tremendous amount of screen real estate. But it's also drawn to that text, right? The white text. DSC has what you need to look, feel, and smell your best because it's white. It stands out from the darker background. There's a million edges there where there's very stark contrast. Your eye naturally goes there. Same goes for the Get Started button below that. That orange really stands out from the background. It's not the color that's doing that. It's the contrast. Here's another example. Calming, steady blue color we talked about before. What's happening here? Notice how it's not as clear. There's lots of areas of contrast, okay? From the edges of those images, we got two big screens in the background, we got two laptops, we got a box of some sort, docking station sitting between them, and then we've got three products down below. See how each one of those products stands out from the background? There are too many focal points here. Then we've got white text on a darker background in the center. They're trying to put this ghosted square over the images. And then we've got a Learn More button that really doesn't have enough contrast because there's too much noise, too much visual stuff going on around it. There are too many areas where light meets dark. Okay, there are too many borders, too many edges, too many things to look at. Remember the beach example I showed you. The eye is constantly scanning and fixating on all those areas. The more places where there is a huge difference between this edge and that edge, the more difficult it is to focus on anything, to read, to understand, and consequently, to act on what you see. What really needs to come forward in this layout is this Learn More button. That's the most important thing on the screen. That's the call to action. That's what people are really there to do, okay? And it's also what the company wants them to do because they want to sell product. But it's obscured by all that visual noise around it. There's not enough contrast between that and everything else, right? So we're directing their attention to things that they are not here to see and are not here to use. If you design with contrast purposefully, you're keeping the user's focus where it needs to be, on the core content or core action that they need to take. That's where the most contrast should be. Perfect example, UX Pin's landing page. Where's your eye? Your eye is on that headline and your eye is on the action below. Start a free trial. Okay, your eyes are immediately drawn to the field where you put in your email and the button that says Start Free Trial. Why? Because they stand out from the surrounding background. The contrast between the gray and that white, the gray and that blue is massive. So when you look at this, you're going to constantly go to two places, that headline and the field and the button. Headline, field, button, headline, field, button. The other stuff there is simply supporting text, but that's where you're going. All right, so it's a good example where secondary content, secondary actions, and everything else should have lower contrast by degrees. Even look at the nav up at the top. Smaller text, smaller areas, it fades, it recedes to the background. It's not nearly as important or nearly as prominent as the headline and the call to action area. How about here? Does the core content or the core action really stand out? No, it doesn't. There's way too many areas of contrast here. This is very nice to look at. Don't get me wrong. The colors are pleasant. These shapes are interesting, but everything competes with everything else. All that visual noise at the top in that image competes with the button, partly because notice that they've used the same color also. In that blue button in the center where it says Explore Ancestry DNA, look up top. That blue exists all over in little spots in that illustration. If you go down to the bottom, that green bar plus the orange Get Started button, those colors exist up top, okay? They're variations of the same shades. If we gray this out, look what happens. What stands out? That image, this young woman's picture at the top is what stands out, plus that headline. Discover what makes you uniquely you. What really needs to stand out are those calls to action.